They were surrounded, 120 men, cut off, outnumbered, staring at an enemy force nearly 300 times their size. No reinforcements, no artillery support, no clear escape. And yet, they did not surrender. This is the story of the siege that should have failed, and the men who refused to collapse. In the early 1960s, the world was not at peace. The Second World War had ended, but a new conflict, colder, more complicated, and often hidden, had begun. The Cold War stretched across continents, and Africa was becoming one of its newest battlegrounds. In 1960, the vast Central African territory of the Congo declared independence from Belgium. Overnight, a colonial possession became a fragile nation, rich in minerals, poor in unity, and dangerously unstable. One province in particular, Katanga, refused to remain under the new central government.
Backed by Belgian business interests and foreign mercenaries, Katanga declared itself independent. What followed was chaos, mutiny, political assassinations, and a proxy struggle that pulled in global powers. To prevent total collapse, the United Nations deployed peacekeeping forces under the banner of the United Nations Operation in the Congo. Among those sent were Irish soldiers, young men, most in their early 20s, serving far from home under blue helmets rather than national flags. They were not sent to wage war. They were sent to keep the peace, and that is precisely why what happened next was so shocking. In September 1961, a small Irish unit, A Company, 35th Battalion, was deployed to the remote mining town of Jadotville in Katanga.
Their mission was straightforward: protect civilians and maintain order. They numbered just 120 soldiers, commanded by a calm, deliberate officer named Commandant Pat Quinlan. They had light weapons, rifles, machine guns, limited mortars, and no heavy armor, no tanks, no air support. They believed they were positioned in a quiet sector. They were wrong. Katangese forces, supported by European mercenaries and hardened by weeks of skirmishes, were preparing something far larger. Operation Morthor, a UN initiative aimed at arresting Katangese leadership, had escalated tensions dramatically. Katanga's leadership viewed it as aggression. Retaliation was inevitable, and Jadotville was isolated. At dawn on September 13, 1961, the attack began. Mortar rounds slammed into the Irish perimeter. Machine gun fire erupted from the surrounding bush. Hundreds, then thousands of Katangese troops advanced, supported by armored cars, and even a Fuga Majester jet conducting strafing runs.
The Irish had dug defensive trenches. They had prepared fallback positions. Quinlan had insisted on it, even when others believed the threat was minimal. That decision would save lives. Wave after wave assaulted the perimeter, but the Irish held. Their machine gun teams cut down advancing fighters with disciplined fire. Mortar crews responded with precise counter-battery shots. Communication lines stayed intact. This was not chaos. It was organized resistance, and the attackers were stunned. They had expected a quick collapse, an overwhelmed peacekeeping unit surrendering within hours. Instead, they encountered controlled, calculated defense. By the end of the first day, the Katangese had suffered heavy casualties. The Irish had suffered remarkably few. But the siege had only begun.
The problem was not courage. The problem was mathematics. 120 defenders, up to 30,000 hostile forces in the broader operational area, and no relief column coming. Requests for reinforcement were sent. Support never arrived. Supply lines were cut. Water began running low. Ammunition had to be rationed carefully. Every bullet fired had to count. And still, the attacks continued. On the second day, armored cars attempted to breach the perimeter. The Irish knocked them out with anti-tank fire and concentrated machine gun bursts. On the third day, another airstrike roared overhead. The defenders adapted. They repositioned constantly. They avoided predictable patterns. They conserved energy under the scorching African sun. Morale remained surprisingly steady. Why? Because leadership matters in a siege. Commandant Quinlan refused panic. He refused dramatic gestures. Instead, he emphasized discipline and preservation of life. He understood something crucial. Their objective was not glory. It was survival. As the days dragged on, something unexpected happened. The attackers' confidence began to erode. Each failed assault chipped away at their morale. Each armored vehicle destroyed sent a message.
This was no symbolic peacekeeping post. This was a fortress, but the Irish position was deteriorating quietly. Water supplies were nearly gone. Medical resources were thin. Radio communication grew uncertain. The siege stretched into its 5th day, and now reality pressed in. Without water, without ammunition resupply, without hope of reinforcement, how long could they realistically hold? Heroism does not erase logistics. Courage does not refill canteens. By September 17th, the situation was unsustainable.
Estimates suggest the attackers suffered hundreds killed and wounded. The Irish defenders were physically exhausted and critically low on resources. Quinlan made the hardest decision a commander can make. He chose surrender, not out of defeat in battle, but to prevent pointless loss of life. Negotiations began under a flag of truce. The Irish soldiers marched out, disciplined and intact, not broken, not routed. Simply out of options, they were taken prisoner. But here is what shocked observers afterward. There had been no catastrophic breach, no collapse of morale, no disorganized retreat. The siege had ended not because the defense failed tactically, but because isolation made continuation impossible. 120 men had held off a force hundreds of times their size for 5 days, and they had done it with professionalism that surprised even their adversaries. Yet when they returned home to Ireland, they were not celebrated. In fact, for years, their story faded into obscurity.
Why? Because surrender, even a strategic one, carries stigma. Cold War politics complicated the narrative. Peacekeeping missions were sensitive. And so the Siege of Jadotville became a quiet footnote rather than a headline. But history has a way of resurfacing. Decades later, investigations re-examined the battle. Military analysts studied the defensive tactics, the professionalism, the casualty ratios, and the verdict shifted. This had not been a defeat. It had been one of the most effective defensive actions in modern Irish military history. In 2016, the Irish government formally recognized the soldiers of Jadotville for their bravery and discipline. What had once been silence became acknowledgement. So why does this siege matter? Because it challenges how we define victory. Is victory holding ground forever, or is it preserving your men against impossible odds? Is surrender always failure?
Or can it be a rational, humane conclusion when objectives have been fulfilled? The siege also reveals something deeper about modern warfare. Not all wars are fought for conquest. Some are fought in the gray spaces, peacekeeping missions where rules of engagement are constrained, political stakes are immense, and clarity is scarce. Jadotville was not a clash of empires. It was a collision of post-colonial instability, Cold War tension, and human resilience. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by massive armies and sweeping invasions. Sometimes it turns quietly, in a dusty perimeter, far from headlines. Imagine the psychological strain. 5 days under constant fire, knowing reinforcements may never come, watching supplies dwindle, hearing mortar rounds slam into defensive lines, and still maintaining order. That is not cinematic exaggeration. That is discipline. That is training.
That is leadership. And perhaps that is why this siege deserves its place among the great against all odds stands of history. Not because it ended in triumphal banners, but because it demonstrated professionalism under pressure. If Jadotville had collapsed on the first day, it would have reinforced the perception that UN forces were weak and vulnerable. Instead, it forced opponents to respect the capability of peacekeepers. It reshaped operational assumptions. It proved that even lightly equipped forces, when well led and well prepared, can impose disproportionate cost. And that lesson echoes into modern peacekeeping operations today. Across continents, across decades, 120 men, 5 days, against thousands. They did not change the global balance of power. They did not topple governments, but they proved something timeless. Preparation matters. Leadership matters. And sometimes, survival itself is the victory.
The echoes of Jadotville still linger, not in grand monuments, but in the quiet recognition that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it holds the line, until holding no longer serves life. If you enjoy uncovering forgotten chapters of history, the battles that didn't fit neatly into textbooks, subscribe for more stories where the past feels alive, human, and unexpectedly powerful. Because history is not just what happened,
It is what we choose to remember.